My challenge, my remaining, job is really to challenge you with this proposition that supposing that now the ASEAN governments, the 10 ASEAN governments, see all those wonderful opportunities out there, which have been well articulated, I'm sure, in this morning session. What would they do? How would they go about helping make them happen? And I can see that this is the time when we have to rely on the visible hand of the government, not the invisible hand of government. So the visible hand of the government, but not in the sense of retarding the progress or pulling back, but pushing, not pulling, pushing the AEC vehicle forward rather than backward. So the visible hand of government is very important. I think there's enough said about the private sector. The private sector is actually all those foot soldiers who have been fighting at the, up front all along. And, there's no need really to tell them, what they need to do. But we need to remind the commanding officers in the rear, the government, that in order to exploit all these wonderful opportunities, and I believe that by 2015, with the start of another cycle, maybe business cycle, things will look much better, more promising. But will we be ready, to take on that good, new beginning again? And here I see the need to address a number of issues for the government. First of all, the so-called three famines. The Chinese called it famines. In other words, shortage, energy, money, capital, money, and people. You have to address those problems. And I think these three shortages have to be squarely addressed by the government. Without those three, I don't think that you can really, even McKinsey cannot do anything how should I say, to take on this opportunity. On the reverse side of that, there are three big mountains. I'm using the Chinese terminology now. The three big mountains that we have to overcome. One is how to mobilize capital. One is how to mitigate the heavy tax burden. And thirdly, how to lessen the very strict governmental control and intervention in business. I'm sure that I'm overstating my welcome, I don't know, but these are parallel issues that have to be dealt with. The three shortages and the three big mountains, what do you do? Another issue that I think we need to address is the fact that for the government to look at what has really been driving the economies of ASEAN and the economies of East Asia. And here you can see very well that export is a major factor, and we still have to keep up with our exports if we want to have the economy continue. How do we get the second thing, consumption among the people, going? And in China in particular, because consumption in China has been a major issue, people are not spending money. And that is partly because of the skewed structure of the Chinese economy as a result of the government's preference for the public sector and not enough emphasis put on the private sector. But again, I think in a country like Thailand, we need to look at this question of consumption and how to make consumption a driving force for developing the economy. And another issue, of course, is investment. Where do you get the investment? The private sector in Thailand, in ASEAN, has, in most countries in ASEAN, has had this issue with private investment since the ASEAN crisis, the Asian crisis in the 90s. private investment has been down. But what we are hoping to see more and more, or to attract more and more, is external investment. External investment from America, from Europe, probably going to be much less in the next few years. But to make up for that, we are going to expect, more possibilities from China, maybe India, and maybe some other countries. But take a look at China, for instance. Right now, China has already formulated a policy to invest heavily in the developing economies, especially economies where there are natural resources which the Chinese state, needs or wants. So, but they are ready to pour in a lot of investment. I'm sure that ASEAN would be part of that, part of the picture of the places that they would like to invest heavily, because ASEAN has all these all the things that China wants, for instance, natural resources, mainly natural resources, energy. Remember right at the moment the problem is shortage of energy. Where we're going to get the energy, and China is now energy hungry. They need.
I think multinationals have long realized the potential of this region, and particularly in the 1980s, 1990s. And if we look at some of the FDI inflows over a longer-term horizon, the ASEAN's share of world total FDI flows actually has been much higher in the 1990s. And in the 2000s, post-1997 Asian financial crisis, its share of world direct investment flows has almost halved. But what is interesting really was what Dr. Surin has pointed out on developments over the last few years, that prior to the 2008 global crisis in 2007, ASEAN reached a record level in terms of its FDI inflows, although the share is still about 3.8% of world total share. And then after it has plunged in 2008, 2009, it has shot back in 2010 to a new record level. Of course, FDI inflows from year to year can be quite lumpy and volatile, but this is indeed an encouraging sign. And if we look at some of the shares of countries receiving the 2010 share of ASEAN FDI inflows, then the biggest recipients would be Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand. But so, although FDI flows in the region have been robust, the bulk of the flows have come from outside of the region. And so the flow of ASEAN FDI inflows accounted for by member countries' outflows average only about 14% of the total inflows. So relatively fewer local companies in ASEAN are engaging in outward direct investments into the ASEAN region. If we take a look at the country share, again, on a yearly basis, the shares of individual members' country fluctuate. But by recipient countries, if you look over a 10-year cumulative period, then the top recipients of intra-ASEAN FDI inflows would be Indonesia, around 25% of the total intra-ASEAN flows. Thailand is also receiving around 25%, followed by Singapore and Malaysia. And if you look at who are the biggest investors in ASEAN from among the ASEAN member countries, then even just looking at a few years bar charts, you could see that Singapore has by far been the largest investor in the region, followed by Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand. Thailand's share fluctuates from year to year, but on a cumulative basis, it is still not a major investor in the ASEAN countries, accounting for about 3.4% or so. And of course, what may account for this relatively low intra-ASEAN share in total ASEAN FDI inflows? One reason may be that some of the local companies, especially the larger ones, may have focused their attention to investment locations outside of the ASEAN region, for example, in China and India. And if you look at some of the outward FDI numbers from Singapore and Malaysia, there is indeed some sign that a growing share of their outward foreign direct investment inflows are going to China, and a declining share going to ASEAN. And of course, the other reason, which is more likely the primary reason, is that local companies, there are still as yet not enough local companies who have acquired the competitive advantage to venture and engage in outward investments.
Follow Towards 2015 every Wednesday and Thursday from 10:30 p.m. to 11 p.m. on ASEAN TV. And you can also follow us online via Facebook, only on ASEAN TV.